Under the ancient oak trees of Charleston, a broken veteran laid his last $150 on a deed everyone else feared to touch. They called the estate cursed, a place of vanishing families and whispered footsteps echoing through empty halls. But when he pushed open that heavy wooden door, it wasn't emptiness waiting in the shadows. Two dark eyes stared back at him, a German shepherd, alive and unafraid, as if guarding secrets buried for over a century. And from that moment, his gamble was no longer about finding shelter. It was about uncovering a legacy that would transform his soul forever. The winter air in Charleston carried heavy dampness. Salt from the nearby harbor mixed with the earthy smell of old brick buildings weathered by centuries of storms. Streets glistened from earlier drizzle, amber reflections from corner streetlights stretching across wet pavement like liquid gold. This was a city of legends and lost dreams, where history clung to every palmetto tree swaying in the coastal breeze. And it was here that Daniel Rivera found himself, searching not for glory, but simply for a place where his nightmares might find peace. Daniel Rivera was 49, his body still carrying the disciplined posture of his army years, though now marked by invisible weight from too many deployments. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with scars both visible and hidden. His black hair showed streaks of premature grey, and his dark brown eyes held that 1,000-yard stare fellow veterans recognized instantly. The lines around those eyes spoke of desert suns and sleepless nights, of brothers lost and promises broken by forces beyond any soldier's control. He lived alone in a cramped studio apartment that smelled perpetually of mildew and broken dreams. The walls were paper-thin, the radiator clanged without providing warmth, and the ceiling bore water stains that looked like maps of countries he'd rather forget. 3 years earlier, his wife Isabella had looked at him with exhausted love and said words that still echoed daily. "I can't keep waiting for you to come home, Daniel. Your body is here, but your heart never left that desert." She packed her bags that afternoon, taking their daughter Sophia to Atlanta. Daniel watched them drive away and felt something inside him break completely. That night, hunched over his second-hand laptop at a wobbly card table, he scrolled aimlessly through the internet wasteland. Job boards filled with rejections, news articles about conflicts he'd rather not remember, social media posts from people whose problems seemed impossibly trivial. Then a headline caught his attention: "Historic Charleston Property Auction. Own a Piece of Southern History." Rows of photographs appeared, showing grand antebellum mansions with towering columns and wraparound porches. Most were priced beyond his dreams, but one thumbnail stopped him cold. The photograph was grainy, poorly lit, almost as if whoever took it didn't want to capture the property clearly. The mansion was enormous, its paint peeled to grey weathered bones, windows sagging under decades of neglect, thick vines crawling across its facade like gnarled fingers. The description was brief. Ravens Hollow Manor, built 1898, structurally questionable, sold as is. Starting bid $150. $150. He'd spent more on groceries during difficult months when nightmares made it hard to leave the apartment. No Charleston property could possibly be available for such an absurd price. But even as his logical mind catalogued every possible disaster, another part whispered possibilities. Space to breathe, silence from peace, not loneliness, a place where Spanish moss swayed instead of harsh wind rattling apartment windows. He imagined belonging somewhere, having roots deeper than a month-to-month lease. Isabella's parting words echoed, "You'll never give us a real home, Daniel. You don't even know what home means anymore." Perhaps it was too late for his family, but maybe not too late to discover what home actually meant. The cursor hovered over the bid button. "What do you think, Isabella?" he whispered to the empty apartment. "Think I'm crazy enough to try this?" His fingers moved without conscious thought. He clicked. Minutes dragged as he watched the numbers rise, then falter. The screen blinked. "Congratulations. You are the winning bidder. Final purchase price, $150. The next morning, Daniel sat across from Frederick Williamson, an elderly attorney whose office smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Frederick slid the deed across his cluttered desk with trembling fingers. "All sales are absolutely final," he said, pale blue eyes mixing concern with morbid curiosity. "But I'd be lying if I didn't tell you. There's a damn good reason that place went so cheap." "What kind of reason?" Frederick leaned back, shoulders sagging under invisible weight. "Some call it cursed. Families move in. They don't stay long. Week, maybe 2 at most. Others say the house remembers too much pain. Either way, nobody wants to live there." He studied Daniel's face. "You're military, aren't you?" Daniel nodded. "Army. 3 tours in Afghanistan." "Then maybe you've got the backbone it takes," Frederick muttered. "Lord knows nobody else has lasted more than a few nights. Last family packed up in the middle of the night, left half their furniture behind." The drive to Ravens Hollow Manor took him through countryside that grew progressively wilder. Ancient live oaks draped with Spanish moss formed natural tunnels over cracked asphalt, their branches creating canopy so thick that grey afternoon light struggled to penetrate. His battered pickup coughed as it navigated winding lanes that seemed to lead into forgotten corners of South Carolina's past. At the first gas station, a weathered man named Tommy Garrett emerged to meet him. "You just passing through?" Tommy asked, wiping oil-stained hands on a rag. "Actually, I'm moving in. Just bought a place out this way." Tommy's head tilted. Wouldn't happen to be that old place on Magnolia Ridge Road, the one they call Ravens Hollow. Daniel nodded. Tommy let out a low whistle, shaking his head like a doctor delivering bad news. "Then you'd better prepare yourself, friend. That house doesn't keep folks. Not for long." He didn't elaborate, just continued wiping the same spot until his knuckles turned white. As Daniel drove deeper into countryside, word of his destination seemed to travel ahead. People working in yards paused to watch his truck pass, conversations stopping mid-sentence. Children playing fell silent, watching with wide-eyed stares. Elderly men on store porches lowered their voices. "That's him, the veteran who bought it. Poor bastard doesn't know what he's gotten into." It wasn't anger he sensed, but something more unsettling, pity mixed with morbid fascination, as if they were watching a man walking unknowingly toward doom. The road narrowed to gravel, then packed dirt. Ancient trees pressed closer, creating a natural tunnel that blocked the grey sky. Then suddenly, the trees parted like curtains, and Ravens Hollow Manor appeared like something from a fever dream. The mansion loomed 3 stories high, weathered timber and cracked stone stretching toward grey sky. Windows, some boarded, others gaping empty like hollow eyes, reflected only shadows and decades of abandonment. Victorian trim work hung in twisted strips, giving the structure the appearance of something slowly unraveling. Daniel parked at the circular drive's edge, sitting motionless behind the wheel, staring at what was now legally his. The silence was profound, broken only by wind through Spanish moss and distant water moving through hidden creeks. The air felt heavier here, carrying scents of decay and wild growth, wood returning to earth and vines reclaiming human construction. He approached the front porch with careful, measured steps. Wooden boards groaned and sagged, protesting after years of supporting nothing heavier than rain and fallen branches. The massive oak door was darkened to almost black, its brass hardware tarnished green. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, turning with a solid click. The door swung open with a long, mournful groan that rolled through the interior like a wave. Daniel stepped inside, and the air hit him like a physical presence. The atmosphere was thick and stale, carrying accumulated weight of decades of abandonment. Mustiness of old wood, sweetness of rot, metallic taste of dust that had settled so deeply it had become part of the house itself. But there was something else his combat-trained senses detected immediately. The feeling of being watched. He dropped his duffel bag and pulled out his heavy flashlight. The beam cut through gloom, revealing an impossibly grand entrance hall. A massive staircase curved upward into shadows, its carved banister elegant despite dust and cobwebs. A crystal chandelier hung from the high ceiling, facets dulled by grime but hinting at spectacular light shows from better days. That's when he heard it. Soft claws clicking against hardwood, coming from deeper in the house. Daniel froze, hand moving automatically toward his combat knife. The sound came again, deliberate and measured, not random scurrying but purposeful movement of something large and alive. He swept his flashlight toward the sound, and there, at the hall's far end, two eyes caught the light and reflected it back like twin stars. The German shepherd stepped into the light with the dignity of a king granting audience. The dog was magnificent despite his rough condition. Large and powerfully built, probably 90 pounds, his coat a rich mixture of black and tan, speaking of excellent breeding. He was thin but not starving, ribs visible beneath thick fur. Pointed ears stood at perfect attention, dark, intelligent eyes fixed on Daniel with assessment that seemed almost human in complexity. But what struck Daniel most was the complete absence of fear or aggression. There was caution and regal wariness, but no growling, no defensive stance. The dog simply stood there, head high, studying this arrival with calm patience, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Well, I'll be damned," Daniel said softly. "Looks like I'm not the first one to decide this place might make a decent home." The German shepherd tilted his magnificent head at Daniel's voice, ears swiveling forward. Then, with ceremonial movements, he took several steps closer, paws silent on dust-covered floor. He moved with fluid grace of an animal completely comfortable in his surroundings, someone who knew every board and corner of this abandoned mansion. Daniel crouched slowly, making himself less threatening while keeping hands visible. He recognized intelligence and discipline in this animal's bearing. This was no ordinary stray seeking shelter. This was a dog with training, with purpose, with a story Daniel was only beginning to glimpse. "Easy, boy," he murmured, extending his palm up. "We're both just looking for a place to call home, aren't we?" The German shepherd considered this for an eternity, dark eyes never leaving Daniel's face. Then, with diplomatic dignity, he padded forward and touched his cold, wet nose to Daniel's outstretched palm. After careful evaluation, his tail gave a single, measured wag. Small gesture, but it felt like acceptance, the beginning of alliance between two survivors, recognizing something essential in each other. "I think I'll call you Major," Daniel said quietly, remembering military working dogs from Afghanistan. "You've got the bearing for it. What do you say? Want to help me figure out what we've gotten into?" Major's tail wagged more confidently, and he settled back on haunches in a position both relaxed and alert. His message was clear. He was willing to trust this human, at least provisionally, but would be watching, evaluating, ready to act if Daniel proved unworthy. Together, they began systematic exploration of Ravens Hollow Manor, moving through the first floor with military precision. Major padded silently beside him, occasionally stopping to investigate particular spots with intense focus, his nose reading stories written in scents Daniel's human senses couldn't detect. The parlor retained ghostly furniture outlines in dust patterns on hardwood, rectangular shadows where sofas had sat, circular marks where tables had held lamps and intimate objects of daily life. Wallpaper, once elegant roses or vines, now hung in strips that curled like dying leaves. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened with soot and filled with debris from years of neglect. The dining room was more haunting, with empty built-in china cabinets, glass doors cracked in spiderweb patterns catching and fracturing weak light. The room felt like it was still waiting for guests who would never arrive, conversations that would never resume, meals that would never be served on china that had long since disappeared. In the kitchen, Daniel found evidence of the house's age and former grandeur. A massive cast-iron stove sat like a monument to vanished ways of life. Copper pots still hung from wall hooks, surfaces green with verdigris, but hinting at lustrous beauty they'd once possessed. Most surprisingly, When Daniel worked the handle of an old hand-pumped well in the corner, clear, cold water still flowed. Major seemed particularly interested in certain areas, his behavior growing alert and focused whenever they approached a narrow door half hidden behind peeling wallpaper near the kitchen. The dog would stop and sniff intensely at the door's base, ears pricked forward, tail at attention, before looking back at Daniel with an expression that seemed to say, "This is important. Pay attention." As afternoon faded toward evening, Daniel made temporary camp in the front parlor, spreading his sleeping bag near the massive fireplace. Major settled nearby, close enough for comfort, but maintaining enough distance to preserve independence. As darkness fell and autumn wind picked up outside, Raven's Hollow Manor started its nightly symphony. Old timber expanded and contracted, creating groans that seemed to come from the house's very bones. Pipes ticked and knocked in walls, remnants of heating systems that had probably never worked properly. Daniel lay cataloguing each sound, evaluating for threats. Major lifted his head occasionally, ears swiveling toward noises, but showed no alarm. Whatever presence haunted this place posed no immediate danger. If anything, Daniel found the sounds oddly comforting after years of hypervigilance. There was something honest about a house that announced its moods so clearly, that wore its age and weariness openly rather than hiding behind false facades. Morning arrived grey and misty, fog rolling from nearby marshlands. Daniel woke to find Major gone, panic flaring until he heard scratching at the front door. When he opened it, the German shepherd was there with a large rabbit in his mouth, tail wagging with unmistakable pride. "Well, I'll be damned," Daniel said, accepting the offering. "Looks like you know how to take care of business, Major." As he built a fire and cooked the rabbit, Daniel began developing his renovation strategy. The attorney had been right about structural challenges. The roof needed extensive work, plumbing required complete replacement, electrical systems were actively dangerous, but the fundamental bones were remarkably solid, built with old-growth timber and expert craftsmanship that simply wasn't available anymore. But first, he needed to understand what he was really dealing with. The locals' stories intrigued rather than frightened him. Places that made people uncomfortable usually had excellent reasons rooted in human history rather than supernatural nonsense. If this house was trying to communicate something, Daniel was prepared to listen with patience from years of gathering intelligence in complex situations. The second day brought their first breakthrough. While exploring the second floor, Daniel discovered bedrooms still containing furniture covered with dusty sheets, apparently forgotten when last residents fled. Under sheets, he found beautifully carved four-poster beds, ornate dressing tables with mirrors reflecting distorted images through accumulated grime, wardrobes still containing clothing from the 1970s and 1980s. But it was in the master bedroom that Major's keen nose led them to their first significant discovery. The German shepherd became intensely focused on wainscoting that looked identical to every other wall section, pawing persistently until Daniel investigated closely. When he pressed against the wood, he felt it give slightly, revealing this section was actually a hidden panel. Behind the false wall, Daniel found a narrow compartment containing a leather-bound journal wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and decay. The journal belonged to Margaret Whitmore, and its pages revealed a woman who had lived in this house during the 1940s and 1950s, watching as her family's fortune crumbled and the once grand estate began its slow decline. Margaret's entries painted a picture of a house that had once been the center of a thriving plantation, home to generations of Whitmores who had built wealth on cotton and rice cultivation before the Civil War devastated their fortunes. The family had struggled through Reconstruction and early 20th century decades, selling land and valuables just to maintain their grip on the ancestral home. Margaret's final entries, dated in the early 1960s, revealed a woman consumed by guilt over her family's past, particularly their treatment of enslaved people who had built and maintained the plantation. She wrote of sleepless nights filled with footsteps in empty hallways, voices calling names she couldn't understand, growing conviction that the house was trying to tell her something important she was failing to comprehend. Margaret's last entry was haunting. The house remembers everything, every person who lived and died here, every act of kindness and cruelty within these walls. I think it's trying to make me understand that their stories deserve to be told, that they shouldn't be forgotten just because they were inconvenient truths. But I don't know how to listen, and I'm afraid I'm running out of time. Daniel closed the journal slowly, feeling Margaret's words settling into his bones. He sat against the dusty wall with Major's head resting on his leg, as if the German shepherd understood the gravity of discovery. Margaret's story was familiar in ways that cut deep. She had been haunted by inherited guilt, struggling to make amends for previous generations' sins. Her sleepless nights reminded him of his own battles with memories that refused burial. But there was something else in Margaret's words, speaking to larger truth about Ravens Hollow Manor and the land it stood on. This house wasn't just repository of one family's secrets. It was built on suffering of people whose names had been forgotten, whose stories had been deliberately erased, whose contributions to plantation wealth had been systematically ignored. That evening, making camp in the parlor, Daniel thought about his grandmother Rosa, who had possessed encyclopedic knowledge of hidden histories of grand houses where she'd worked as domestic servant. She had told him stories of enslaved people who were master craftsmen, house servants who raised white children while forbidden to live with their own families, field hands with deep agricultural knowledge who received no credit. "The houses remember, mijo," she had told him. "Even when people try to forget, even when they write pretty histories that leave out ugly truths, the houses remember. The walls hold on to everything. Someday, somebody's going to have to listen to what they're trying to say." Now, sitting in Ravenshollow's parlor with Major beside him and Margaret's journal in his lap, Daniel began understanding why he'd been led here. It wasn't coincidence, and it wasn't just his need for shelter. He had been chosen for this work, selected to be the one who would finally listen to what this house had been trying to communicate for over a century. The next morning brought a breakthrough that changed everything. Major had been restless during the night, pacing halls and investigating sounds only his keen ears could detect. When Daniel woke, he found the German shepherd sitting alertly before the narrow door they'd noticed near the kitchen, sealed behind peeling wallpaper. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked, kneeling to examine the door closely. "What have you found?" Major whined softly and pawed at the door's base, behavior indicating clearly he sensed something significant behind weathered wood. Daniel ran his hands along the edges, feeling for movement. The door was solid oak, darkened with age, but when he pushed with steady pressure, it shifted slightly. Using his combat knife as lever, Daniel began working at the edges, carefully prying at the frame until he found the resistance source. Someone had nailed the door shut from outside, using long iron nails rusted over decades, but still holding. It took nearly an hour of patient work to remove enough nails to allow the door to swing open, hinges protesting with groans that seemed to echo through the entire house. Behind the door lay a narrow staircase leading down into darkness, steps worn smooth by countless feet. Air rising from the basement was cool and damp, carrying scents of earth and stone and something else speaking of human habitation and long-forgotten activities. Major stepped forward confidently, tail wagging as he began descending with sure-footed grace. Daniel followed, flashlight beam cutting through darkness to reveal a basement far more extensive than expected. The space was divided into several rooms, some clearly for storage, others that appeared to have served as living quarters. The walls were expertly fitted and mortared stone, speaking to skilled craftsmen who had built this hidden level. But it was the last room that took Daniel's breath away and made him understand why Margaret Whitmore had spent her final years haunted by voices and footsteps no one else could hear. The chamber was large and well ventilated, with small windows set high in walls that would have allowed natural light during day. Along one wall stood simple wooden beds, frames still sturdy despite decades of abandonment. Against another wall, shelves held remnants of personal belongings, combs and brushes, small mirrors, carefully folded clothing, children's toys carved from wood with loving attention. This had been living quarters for enslaved people who worked at Ravenshollow Manor, a hidden community existing beneath the grand mansion where the Whitmore family lived in comfort. These were people whose labor built and maintained the estate, whose skills created wealth that allowed the White family such elegance, whose stories had been systematically erased from official property history. In the room's center stood a large wooden table, surface scarred by years of use, but still solid. And on that table, Daniel found what he had somehow known he would find: a collection of documents and artifacts telling the real story of Ravenshollow Manor, preserved and hidden by people who understood their truth needed to survive, even if they themselves did not. The papers were yellowed and fragile, but carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in metal containers, protecting them from moisture and decay. There were birth and death records, maintained in flowing handwriting of someone clearly educated, despite laws forbidding teaching enslaved people to read and write. There were letters written to family members sold to other plantations, expressing love and hope and determination to remain connected despite forces seeking to tear families apart. Most significantly, there was a detailed journal written by someone identifying himself only as Samuel, documenting daily life at Ravenshollow Manor from the perspective of people who actually did the work keeping the plantation running. Samuel's entries revealed a community of remarkable resilience and dignity, people who maintained humanity and connections despite living under a system designed to crush their spirits. Samuel's final entry, dated just days before the Civil War's end, contained a prophecy that made Daniel's hands tremble. The house will remember us when the family has forgotten. Someone will come, someone who understands what it means to carry burdens that ain't entirely your own. That person will hear our voices and tell our stories, and then maybe we can finally rest. Daniel sat in that hidden room's silence, surrounded by preserved remnants of lives lived fully despite unimaginable constraints, feeling the full weight of his purpose settling on his shoulders. Major pressed against his leg, offering comfort, and in the dog's dark eyes he could see reflected his own understanding of what needed to be done. Over following weeks, Daniel threw himself into restoration work with surprising intensity. But this wasn't just renovation now, it was restoration in the truest sense, bringing back to light the complete history of Ravenshollow Manor, not just the sanitized version passed down through White family records. Major proved invaluable, his senses alerting Daniel to hidden spaces and forgotten artifacts human eyes alone would never discover. Together, they uncovered room after room in the basement level, each telling part of the story of the community that had lived and worked beneath the grand mansion. There was a workshop where skilled craftsmen had created elaborate furniture and decorative elements gracing upper floors, tools still hanging on hand-forged hooks. There was a kitchen where dozens of meals had been prepared daily, not just for the White family, but for the extended community of workers who had formed their own family bonds, despite legal systems denying them formal marriages. Most moving was a small room that had clearly served as a school, with rough wooden benches arranged facing a makeshift blackboard. On shelves along walls, Daniel found primers and reading books, pages worn soft by countless hands, evidence of secret educational systems operating in direct violation of laws designed to keep enslaved people ignorant. Samuel's journal had mentioned this school, noting with pride that our children learn to read despite what the law says, because knowledge is the one thing they can never take from us. As Daniel worked to preserve and document discoveries, he began reaching out to historians and genealogists, sharing what he'd found and asking for help tracing descendants of people documented in Samuel's journal and other basement records. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Scholars from universities across the South contacted him, excited by such complete records of enslaved people's daily lives, information usually lost forever when plantation records were destroyed or sanitized. More importantly, families began reaching out, people who had searched for generations to learn about ancestors whose stories had been deliberately erased. Daniel found himself serving as bridge between past and present, connecting living descendants with preserved words and artifacts of their forebears, helping restore family connections severed by slavery's violence and its aftermath. One of the first visitors was Cordelia Washington, an elderly woman who drove down from Columbia after hearing about Daniel's discoveries through church networks connecting black communities throughout the South. Cordelia was in her 80s, silver hair braided into an intricate crown, eyes holding accumulated wisdom from decades fighting for civil rights. She walked with a carved wooden cane, but her bearing was straight and proud. "My great-great-grandmother was named Patience," she told Daniel as he welcomed her into the restored parlor. "Family stories said she worked at a big house near Charleston, but we never knew which one. All the old records got lost during Reconstruction." Daniel led her to the basement, Major padding quietly beside them, and watched as she examined preserved living quarters with tears streaming down weathered cheeks. When they reached Samuel's journal and she saw Patience's name mentioned repeatedly, she sat heavily on one of the wooden benches and wept openly. "She's here," Cordelia whispered, voice choked with feeling. "After all these years of wondering and searching, I finally found her. She's here, and her story survived." She looked at Daniel with eyes shining with gratitude. "You gave her back to me. You gave all of them back to us." More families followed, drawn by word-of-mouth networks and social media posts about Ravens Hollow Manor discoveries. Each visit was an emotional journey as people connected with ancestors they'd thought lost forever, reading their words and touching objects they'd crafted or used daily. Daniel served as both curator and grief counselor, helping people process complex emotions that came with finally learning family history details while confronting brutal realities of the system that had shaped their ancestors' lives. The transformation of Ravens Hollow Manor continued as Daniel used his disability payments and growing donations from visitors to fund restoration work. But this wasn't restoration aimed at recreating antebellum grandeur that had impressed wealthy white visitors. Instead, Daniel was creating something entirely new, a place honoring the complete property history, acknowledging both beauty and horror, privilege and suffering that had coexisted within these walls. The Grand Parlor became a museum space where visitors could learn about daily lives of both the enslaved community and white family, seeing how their stories intertwined in complex ways simple narratives couldn't capture. The basement rooms were carefully preserved and open to the public, allowing people to walk through spaces where their ancestors had lived and worked, seeing tools they'd used and books they'd studied in secret. Major had grown sleek and healthy during their months at Ravens Hollow Manor, coat glossy with good nutrition, bearing confident and alert. He seemed to understand their work's importance, often serving as gentle greeter for emotional visitors, offering comfort to people overwhelmed by connecting with family histories. Children, especially, were drawn to him, and Daniel often found the German Shepherd sitting patiently while young visitors read to him from books found in the restored basement classroom. As the first anniversary of Daniel's arrival approached, he reflected on how completely his life had been transformed. The broken veteran who had bid on a house out of desperation had become a bridge between past and present, helping heal wounds that had festered for generations. The nightmares plaguing him since Afghanistan had gradually faded, replaced by dreams filled with voices of gratitude and peaceful presence of people whose stories were finally being told. Isabella called one evening in late autumn, her voice cautious but curious. She had seen a magazine article about Ravens Hollow Manor while waiting in her doctor's office, recognizing Daniel's name in the story about the veteran who had bought a haunted mansion and turned it into a center for historical research and reconciliation. "I saw the article about what you're doing," she said, voice carrying emotion he couldn't identify. "It sounds incredible, Daniel. You sound different too, like you found something you've been looking for." They talked for over an hour, the first real conversation since she left. She told him about Sophia, now 17 and applying to colleges, and he told her about Major and the visiting families and the sense of purpose filling his days. When she said goodbye, there was warmth in her voice he hadn't heard in years. "Maybe Sophia and I could come visit sometime," she said. I'd like to see what you've built there. I'd like to see who you've become." As Daniel hung up and looked around the restored parlor, with Major sleeping peacefully by the fireplace and moonlight streaming through windows that no longer needed boarding, he felt profound completion. The house, once haunted by unfinished business, was now alive with purpose and healing. Stories trapped within its walls for over a century were finally being told, and descendants of people who had built this place with their own hands were finally coming home. The curse of Ravens Hollow Manor, if it had ever truly existed, had been broken not by driving away ghosts, but by listening to what they had been trying to say. Daniel had learned that healing sometimes required opening old wounds, examining painful truths, and refusing to let difficult histories remain buried. But he had also learned that when those wounds were finally cleaned and properly tended, when those truths were acknowledged and honored, real healing could begin. In the end, Daniel Rivera's journey reminds us that forgotten places and forgotten people still have voices waiting to be heard, stories that deserve telling regardless of how uncomfortable they might make us feel. What had seemed cursed was really just history, asking not to be ignored or sanitized. His choice to stay, to listen, and to build bridges between past and present shows us that redemption often begins with courage to face difficult truths and determination to ensure all voices are heard, not just the ones telling comfortable stories. Major still patrols Ravens Hollow Manor's grounds, no longer a stray seeking shelter, but a guardian of stories and greeter of visitors seeking connections to their past. And Daniel continues his work, knowing that every story preserved, every connection restored, every truth acknowledged brings healing not just to individual families, but to the broader human family we all belong to, whether we acknowledge it or not.